Good morning, everyone. It's surely a sign of intellectual magnanimity that you men and women of science would permit a man of theology and history into your conference and then give him the opportunity to respond to the keynote speaker, a distinguished physicist. In gratitude for your ecumenical spirit, I shall not attempt to play on the field of your expertise, but rather to reflect on Dr. Barr's stimulating paper from the perspective of one who has spent some decades thinking about the relationship of biblical religion to the Western civilizational project, and has done so as the biographer of Pope St. John Paul II. Several themes in Dr. Barr's paper strike me as worth underscoring because they challenge regnant shibboleths in Western high culture, misconceptions that impede the dialogue between religious faith and natural science that is so necessary for the flourishing of our civilization. First, as Dr. Barr suggested, but I will say more bluntly, what we know as science is a byproduct of the biblical understanding of nature, and in several ways. First, biblical religion demystified nature. What Barr called the demythologization of nature was an essential step in the human understanding of nature, for so long as the natural world was imagined to be the realm of spirits, demons, and whatnot, humanity dealt with nature through strategies of appeasement and placation rather than through reason, and did so in fear. By demystifying nature, biblical religion helped make it possible to explore and understand the natural world through the arts of reason, and to do so fearlessly. Second, biblical religion is based on the self-revelation of a creator God who is non-competitive with the natural world and is thus neither a threat to the natural world nor an obstacle to understanding it. When God announced his name to Moses as I am who am and I am, in the 3rd chapter of the book of Exodus, God was not declaring himself to be a super being in competition with or over against all the beings of the world. God, in his self-revelation at Sinai, declared himself to be absolute yet creative transcendence, the very condition for the possibility of there being anything at all. Millennia after the writing of the book of Exodus and its description of God's self-revelation to Moses, St. Thomas Aquinas, where is he? There he is, deploying the new learning of his time, the recovered philosophy of Aristotle, would translate the meaning of the self-revelation of the divine name to Moses as God declaring himself to be ipsum esse subsistens, sheer being itself, which is to say that the God of Jews and Christians is the condition for the possibility of the universe, or indeed of any universe, but is not a being among others. To know God and to know the natural world are not competitive or zero-sum human aspirations, because God is not a super being in a competitive or adversarial relationship with other beings. This is the crucial point missed by the atheistic humanists of the 19th and 20th centuries, analyzed by Henri de Lubac in the drama of atheist humanism, and it is the crucial point missed by today's new atheists. As my Thomistic reading of the Old Testament, a reading that would have been quite congenial to John Paul II, suggests, the biblical understanding of a demystified nature was further refined by biblical religion's encounter with the heritage of classical philosophy. One crucial reference point for that encounter was another biblical text, in this case from the New Testament. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. The first sentences of the Gospel of St. John. In crafting the beginning of that gospel that way, the biblical author was clearly echoing the first chapter of the first book of the Hebrew Bible, wherein Genesis informs us that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The gospel writer then deepens our understanding of that divine creative act. For the Johannine account tells us that God created in the beginning through his word, his logos, through a series of speech acts. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered into one, and let the dry land appear," and so it was. The word, the logos of God, is the reason of God, and thus the world created through the logos has a divine rationality, if you will, imprinted into it. As Bishop Robert Barron puts it, if everything came into existence through a word, everything is necessarily stamped by an intelligible form and an intelligible purpose. If one believes in creation, one will readily make two assumptions necessary for the development of the sciences, namely, the world is not God, and hence can be analyzed and experimented upon, and that the world is intelligible, and hence likely to yield results to those who examine it intelligently. Now, there is, of course, nothing recognizable in our terms as science if the natural world is mere randomness without any logic or intelligibility, just as there is no science if the natural world is ultimately inaccessible and impenetrable because it is a realm of spirits, phantoms, and demons who are beyond the grasp of reason. So the Johannine confession that all things were created through the Logos, the reason of God, is concurrently a confession of the natural world's accessibility to human understanding through the arts of reason, because any world created through the outpouring of the divine reason will itself have a built-in rationality and comprehensibility. The implications of this conviction for the development of science need no further elaboration, except to cite Bishop Barron again, quote, "Religion is not only the enemy of science, but in fact the condition for its possibility." Which is why men of faith like Gregor Mendel, with his invention of modern genetics, and Georges Lemaitre, with his Big Bang theory, of the origins of what we know as the universe, could be Catholic priests as well as scientists, and could be so without being intellectually bipolar or schizophrenic. To penetrate the truths embedded in the creation by the Creator, who is ipsum esse subsistens and logos, is one path to the deepening of faith. It is certainly not, or certainly ought not to be, regarded as a threat to faith. Now, the implications of all this for the Western civilizational project and its flourishing today can be sketched briefly. Western civilization is like a pediment resting on three pillars labeled Jerusalem, biblical religion, Athens, Greek philosophy, and Rome, Roman law. In the 19th century, as Father de Lubac demonstrated in the work I cited a moment ago, the atheistic humanists tore down the Jerusalem pillar, claiming that the God of the Bible is the enemy of human maturation and liberation. This, de Lubac also noted, was a great reversal For the God of the Bible had come into human history precisely as a liberator, a deity who did not demand human sacrifice like the gods of Canaan, Philistia, and Mesoamerica, and who did not manipulate human beings on a kind of cosmic gaming board as did the gods of Olympus. This rejection of Jerusalem as one of the pillars of the Western civilizational project had profound and lethal historical consequences. As Father de Lubac wrote in 1942, it is not true that, as is sometimes said, that man cannot organize the world without God. What is true is that without God, man can only ultimately organize the world against each man. A world without the God of the Bible is like a house without windows or doors or skylights. Such a world is a claustrophobic world. And that claustrophobic world turned itself into a circular firing squad as Western civilization almost self-destructed in two cataclysmic Cold Wars and a Cold War. The damage done by atheistic humanism was more than historical, however, it was also intellectual. For it has now turned out that absent the conviction that rationality and intelligibility are built into the world by a creator who creates through the divine logos, humanity's confidence in reason itself becomes shaky, and eventually the Athenian pillar of that Western civilizational project crumbles. The ideology of will then triumphs over reason to the point where reason is rejected, and there remain at best your truth and my truth, but nothing properly describable as the truth. This abandonment of confidence in reason is fouling politics throughout the Western world. It is also fouling science, and especially the life sciences. Thus, in the United States today, gender ideology, as clear and dangerous an expression of the ideology of irrational willfulness as might be imagined, has corrupted such formally reputable scientific societies as the American Academy of Pediatrics, which in defiance of the overwhelming weight of scientific data endorses various transgender therapies for confused and hurting young people, including children. Therapies which have shown no positive mental health outcomes over time, but in fact seem correlated with a disturbing increase in suicidal behavior. The truths embedded in our chromosomes are thus ignored in the name of an ideology of willfulness, which insists that what biblical religion and science know to be the built-in complementarity and fruitfulness of the sexes is actually an oppressive ideological construct. In the American context, this falsification of scientific reality in the name of ideology is now corrupting the third pillar of the civilizational pediment, such that the coercive power of the law is being used in several states to enforce gender ideology and transgender therapies in the name of human rights. As my colleague and friend, the Presbyterian theologian Carl Trueman, wrote recently, transgender ideology would be the stuff of a Marx Brothers movie were it not leading to the government-authorized mutilation of bodies too young to be tattooed, and to the hounding and thuggish bullying of those who refuse to conform to the new pronouns. Former Rhode Island State Assemblyman David Carlin drew the implications of all this for our immediate concerns in his conference when he wrote recently, "The transgender ideology is an attack on the idea that the world is intelligible. Indeed, the ideology is an affirmation of the opposite idea, namely that the world has no objective existence. To sum up, Western civilization, which gave the world what we know as modern science and science's extraordinary accomplishments for the betterment of the human condition and for the human understanding of the natural world, that civilization was built on the three pillars of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome: biblical religion and its distinctive understanding of the nature of God and God's relationship to the world; classical Greek philosophy with its conviction that there are truths embedded in the world and in us, truths that can be known by reason; and Roman legal theory, which asserted the superiority of rationally based law over coercion in the management of human affairs. When biblical religion is excluded from this civilization-supporting and civilization-nurturing triad, faith in the God of the Bible is not all that is lost. So, it seems, is faith in reason. And when faith in reason falters and the will to power dominates high culture, science is corrupted in the name of ideology. In defending the mutual enrichment that comes from a mature dialogue of biblical faith and science, we are defending both the purification of religious understanding and the very possibility of science. For when reason, including scientific reason, closes itself off from what John Paul II termed the horizon of the ultimate, it will turn upon itself and lock itself into the prison of solipsism, in which reason decays into irrationality. Dr. Barr rightly noted the teaching of the Second Vatican Council on what the Council Fathers called the rightful independence of science, a teaching I wholeheartedly endorse. I would add, however, that rightful independence does not warrant arrogance. Science is not omniscient, and a fully realized humanism will recognize that there are other pathways to the truth of things, including the truth of the human condition, than the scientific method. Literature, history, and mysticism disclose truths about the world and about us. So does purified religious faith. Moreover, I would suggest that there are truths that science cannot really explain, or in trying to explain ends up trivializing. To try and explain an Alexander Solzhenitsyn or a Natan Sharansky, a Mother Teresa of Calcutta or a Karol Wojtyła, an Albert Einstein or a Werner Heisenberg, by reference only to genetics and brain chemistry, is an exercise in trivialization. Sacrificial maternal love, soldierly heroism, mystical exaltation, and suffering-born indignity cannot be reduced to emotional states explicable by a combination of neurons and external stimuli without emptying these experiences of their human meaning. And that is because the human person is more than the individual human being who is formed at conception and whose internally directed development is driven by his or her own unique DNA. Just as I would argue that mind cannot be equated solely with brain function, so the human person cannot be grasped without a concept of the soul, the spiritual essence that makes me, me, you, and each of us, each of us. As Catholics, we must recover the nerve to say these things, to insist to our colleagues in academic, intellectual, and professional life, and to insist in the media that religion and science, or faith and empirical knowledge, are not zero-sum games in which one side's gain is the other side's loss. As John Paul II taught in the 1998 encyclical Fides et Ratio, articulating a theme to which his successor, Benedict XVI, would return many times, reason, including scientific reason, purifies faith of superstition, while faith challenges reason, including scientific reason, to think high rather than low, and to ask what will always be the great questions of the human condition. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is good and what is evil? What is happiness and what is delusion? What awaits me after this life? I would also suggest that in a postmodern world increasingly confused about the very meaning of truth, to the point, as I've indicated, where scientists ignore empirical data because of the pressures of ideological conformity, the Catholic tradition of reason has much to offer in its complex understanding of the truth. That truth is accessible, that truth is symphonic, and that truth is liberating. Truth is accessible. There are many ironies in the fires of modernity, and one of the greatest ironies that we have witnessed in our time is that the Catholic Church, charged by many leaders of the 18th century continental European Enlightenment with being the great enemy of reason, has become the world's premier institutional defender of the capacity of human reason to grasp the truth of things. 2.5 centuries after Voltaire urged his compatriots to crush the infamy that was the Church in order to liberate human reason, the Catholic Church stands before a world awash in skepticism and says, with John Paul II in Fides et Ratio, yes, we can get to the truth through the arts of reason. Yes, we can know the deep truths that are embedded in the world and in us, not perfectly perhaps, but we can know them. That conviction about the accessibility of truth can have great historical consequences. Thus, a century after the proponents of atheistic humanism declared the God of the Bible was the enemy of human maturation and liberation, believers in the God of the Bible, inspired by the Bishop of Rome, unleashed a revolution of conscience, a revolution of living in the truth that eventually brought down the greatest tyranny in history, the Soviet Empire. The Catholic insistence that, as John Paul II put it, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth is not a pious abstraction, nor is it an elegant, pious slogan with which to confound an opponent in an exchange on Twitter. It has grave implications for Western democracy. For if there is only your truth and my truth, and neither one of us recognizes anything as the truth, then against what horizon of judgment or by what standard will we settle our differences when your truth comes into conflict with my truth? There is no such horizon or standard. So either you will impose your power on me, or I will impose my power on you. Nietzsche, mad prophet of postmodernity, saw this coming. Joseph Ratzinger prophetically labeled it the dictatorship of relativism the day before his election as Pope Benedict XVI. Pope Francis has described a world without a firm grasp on moral truth as a world without peace because, quote, everyone is his own criterion. Secondly, truth is symphonic. Fragmentation and disintegration are among the chief characteristics of Western intellectual life today. Everything is in bits and pieces, nothing fits together, there's no frame in which the parts can be composed into a whole. Little wonder then that cynicism, skepticism, and irony are prominent features in 21st century Western culture. In the face of all that, the Catholic intellectual tradition insists that fragmentation is not all there is. The Catholic intellectual tradition tells us that there is a symphony of truth in which the various instruments by which we apprehend what is true and good and beautiful play together melodiously. And that which unites the various pieces of human understanding, forged in different kilns, into a mosaic of symphonic truth is love. The love that, as Dante concluded the Divine Comedy, moves the sun and all the other stars. The Trinitarian love, in which the world may recognize the unity for which it yearns, but which it never finds on its own. And then truth is liberating. There are many sorrows in what that great Marian hymn, the Salve Regina, calls Hoc lacrimarum vale, this valley of tears. People of this part of Europe have surely borne over time more than their share of sorrow. But perhaps the characteristic sorrow of 21st century life in Europe, the sorrow that strikes the well-taught Catholic as a true sadness, a self-inflicted wound, is the sorrow that comes from self-absorption. The sorrow we find in the childish sandbox in which the object of worship is the imperial self, the false Trinitarian God called me, myself, and I. The well-taught Catholic, including the Catholic scientist, invites others, both those within the household of faith and those outside it, to reject self-absorption and narcissism and to breathe the bracing, invigorating, liberating air of a life lived in conformity with those truths that are built into reality and into us. For all genuine human liberation is freedom in and freedom for the truth of who we are and the truth of what our eternal destiny is. All genuine human liberation flows from making our lives into the gift for others that life itself is to each of us. If Catholic scientists are both professionally competent and live this law of the gift, as John Paul II called it, inscribed into the very fact of our existence, then you can, through the example of lives lived honorably, compassionately, and with intellectual integrity, help liberate Western culture from the prison of self-absorption, which threatens both the democratic way of life and the integrity of science. Finally, a few concluding thoughts about John Paul II and science. One of the first extended conversations I had when I began preparing the first volume of my John Paul II biography, Witness to Hope, was with the eminent Polish physicist Jerzy Janek, who became a friend of Karol Wojtyła in the late 1940s. Janek told me he learned from Wojtyła, quote, a way of thinking he had never encountered before. Classical Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy, including metaphysics, in which, as Professor Janek put it, one can speak coherently and in a connected way about everything, from the ski poles they carried in the Tatras to God. In the 1950s, Janek created a Krakow-based discussion group for Wojtyła with young scientists, in which the insatiably curious young priest could stay in touch with developments in the hard sciences, a practice that was later revivified when Janek organized biennial scientific seminars for John Paul II at the papal summer residence, Castel Gandolfo. Thus, John Paul II was exceptionally well informed about the scientific universe of discourse, and throughout his papacy did everything he could to build bridges between Catholicism and the sciences, not least, as Dr. Barr indicated, by commissioning a serious exploration of the Galileo affair, shorn of polemics and black legends. This papal engagement with science was an important part of a larger papal project, the development of a nobler humanism capable of sustaining the free and virtuous society in the 21st century. Western civilization had come close to committing suicide on several occasions in the 20th century because of desperately defective ideas of the human person, human origins, human community, and human destiny. Repairing that damage, John Paul II believed, meant articulating a truer humanism in which the Church engaged with science rather than holding science at arm's length, and in which science opened itself to the insights of philosophy and, yes, theology on the inalienable, built-in dignity of the human person, the recognition of which is essential to both personal integrity and social solidarity within the free society. John Paul II was fully aware of the tremendous boon to humanity that modern scientific discoveries and their technological applications had been in fields ranging from medicine to nutrition to knowledge of the universe. Yet he also understood that modernity was as susceptible, and perhaps even more susceptible, to the Promethean temptation, whose biblical analog is the hubris that led Adam and Eve to imagine that they knew better than God about what made for genuine human flourishing. And John Paul believed that a revitalized dialogue between Christian faith and science could help an ever more knowledgeable humanity deploy that knowledge in ways that enhanced human dignity and social solidarity rather than demeaning the former and eroding the latter. I've spoken about the Promethean temptation and described some of the dangers it poses to Western civilization, but let me close by suggesting that an alternative temptation, call it the empiricist temptation, or if you will, the Comtean temptation, is equally lethal. And let me come at this temptation from a personal perspective. I have been a space nut since I was a boy in the early 1960s. In my fourth grade classroom, I listened to a radio broadcast of America's first suborbital space flight, and over the next 8 years, I eagerly followed the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs on television and in books and magazines. I've been proud to have known one of America's most accomplished astronauts, who confessed to me at lunch one day that he was afraid of heights. And I have gotten to know and remain in email contact with the legendary Apollo flight controller, Gene Kranz, who is, by the way, a very devout Catholic and Eucharistic minister. Watching the Earth rise from Apollo 8 on Christmas Eve 1968 remains one of the most stirring experiences of my life. The Hubble Space Telescope and the James Webb Space Telescope are two things for which I happily pay taxes. The images from those two extraordinary technological artifacts are, for me, icons. They are not only depictions of reality, but invitations to imagine the deeper meaning, the why and the what for of that reality. And I hope I don't declare myself a simpleton by saying that in pondering the images that Hubble and Webb have given us, I cannot imagine that all of that is a great cosmic accident that just happened somehow. In the same way, I cannot listen to a Mozart concerto or a Chopin nocturne or a Handel oratorio. I cannot reread the Iliad and the Odyssey and Shakespeare. I can't look at Michelangelo's Pietà or Bernini's Aeneas, Anchises, and Ascanius and take seriously the claim that such beauty and insight are ultimately the byproduct of random cosmic biochemical forces that just happen to produce a habitable planet on which creatures of such self-awareness and capable of creating such transcendent beauty evolved. In a word, these things suggest to me that we really cannot be mere matter, stuff of an ultimately unknown origin, destined for oblivion. Moreover, a half century's study of modern history has taught me that when we do think of ourselves as merely accidental byproducts of cosmic biochemical forces that just happened to come into being within the fine tolerances that made them possible at all, we do terrible things to each other. We create the kind of ideologies that would permit a Stalin to say, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. The West needs scientists who are humanists and who are men and women of faith. May this society nurture such a renewal of our civilization. Thank you.
Thank you, George. It's time for questions, comments. Let me
Please.
start. You mentioned, you rightly pointed out that truth is accessible, is symbolic and liberating.
Symphonic, yes, right. Accessible symphony, liberation, right.
And so you talked about symphony of truth in particular. Now, in natural sciences, as a precondition to do science, we need to also assume the truth is objective. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you can't do science. Can you, with your background as a historian and humanistic background, comment on the notion of objective truth, how you view it, and how it is viewed by the world today?
Well, thank you, Leszek. I think this is part of the problem I was trying to describe, is this corrosion or deterioration of the fact that there is objective truth, that in the base 10 system, 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. It can't equal 5. The trouble today, it seems to me, when Steve was going through that marvelous review of the history, the problems that were being posed to the church were from the hard sciences. And they were often not handled very well, although we're doing better. Now the problems are coming from the life sciences. And they're coming from the life sciences not because we, as church people, don't believe that there is objective truth in biology, genetics, chemistry, etc. It's because ideology is trumping, or pardon, that's a bad word to use anywhere. Ideology is overwhelming that commitment to scientific truth, objective truth, in the name of a false understanding of human rights based on a false understanding of freedom as sheer willfulness. If you will, say in this space, the triumph of Occam over Aquinas. You know, for Occam, freedom was an exercise of the will. For Aquinas, freedom was an exercise of reason. This is a huge problem throughout the Western world today. And I'm not quite sure how we are going to take back the notion of objective truth, except to say that this ideologization of truth is manifestly not contributing to the sum total of human happiness. It's actually intensifying suffering. And at some point, people are going to react to that. Now, what we have to be doing in the meantime is be the defenders of truth. Not only the kind of truth that 2 + 2 always equals 4 in the base 10 system, but the truths that we learn, as I say, from other directions: literature, music, art. Now, just close on this thought. A number of prominent contemporary theologians, most prominently Hans Urs von Balthasar, have suggested that in a world profoundly confused about truth and goodness, the third transcendental, beauty, might be the route back to truth and goodness. Because when you see something that's beautiful, you know it's beautiful. It's not just beautiful for me. It's beautiful in se. And you know that that's good. That's not something wicked or bad. It's life-giving. It's nourishing. So perhaps the further dialogue is between faith and science and the arts in recovering this triad of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome.
Very good. We have more questions? Sorry? Online, all right.
There is an online question from Carolina Cygan, who preferred me to read the question, so I will try. What other arguments do you have to support your thesis that this belief in God can lead science to create ideologies? I assume that we have many scientists who are non-believers, who follow scientific methodology, serve science, and do not create ideologies.
Yeah, I did not suggest that scientists are creating ideologies. I'm saying they're surrendering to ideologies. That's a different thing. The American Academy of Pediatrics knows that there are chromosomes. They ignore that in the name of ideology under political pressure and social pressure. That's not denying the truth of the chromosomal structure of men and women. It's letting that truth, it's surrendering that truth to an ideological and political agenda. And that's a corruption of science in its application, not in its nature. I mean, there's nobody in this insane, I will say insane, transgender business who is claiming that XX chromosomes and XY chromosomes are fungible. I mean, nobody's claiming that. What they're saying is it's irrelevant because there is no objective standard that would prevent so-called sex reassignment surgeries, et cetera, et cetera. This is the cutting edge, the Schwerpunkt, if you will, of this corruption of science by ideology. Thank you all very much. Great to be back in Krakow. Great to be back in this priory where I've spent many, many hours over many years. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for your